Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're unpacking a major escalation in US policy toward Russia, the global oil trade, and the enforcement of sanctions imposed by the United States. These are developments with serious geopolitical implications, and there have been major escalations in recent days. At the center of this unfolding story is a new bipartisan sanctions initiative that has just been approved by President Trump. This legislation that was developed in the US Senate by Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrat Richard Blumenthal is actually designed to significantly increase pressure on Russia, not only through direct sanctions, but also by targeting countries that continue to purchase Russian oil. Under this new proposal that Trump has just approved, the United States president would be granted the authority to impose extraordinary tariffs on oil purchases from Russia, potentially as high as 500%, and also he would be granted the authority to expand sanctions against nations that keep purchasing discounted Russian energy. The goal, according to Lindsey Graham, is to cut off revenue that Moscow uses to finance its military operations. Of course, things are much more complex than that, but that's the official story. Supporters say that this tool gives the United States leverage over major importers like China, India, and Brazil, which are, of course, key customers for Russian crude. But the latest legislative action in Washington isn't happening in a vacuum, and so it's not just words. It seems that the United States has assumed this new, very, very aggressive posture. On the high seas, another front of this geopolitical confrontation is already underway as the United States continues to break international laws, international maritime laws to be more precise, and freedom of navigation. In the Caribbean Sea of Trinidad and Tobago, the United States forces, including the U.S. Coast Guard and military assets, have boarded and seized the oil tanker Olena. This is the second oil tanker that actually operated under the Russian flag that has been seized this week. The vessel is the fifth tanker that has been intercepted in recent weeks as part of an increasingly aggressive U.S. campaign to enforce its own sanctions against oil shipments linked to Venezuela and to Russia. In other words, this is modern-day piracy. The Olena tanker was actually targeted because it was identified as part of what U.S. officials describe as the quote-unquote shadow fleet that is used to evade sanctions. And according to the Wall Street Journal, the Olena had been sanctioned for transporting Russian oil and was intercepted after departing Venezuela. Just days earlier, U.S. forces also seized the oil tanker Marinera, which was formerly sailing under the name of Bella One. The seizure took place after an extended pursuit across the North Atlantic. Russia actually requested that the United States halt its pursuit, but of course that didn't happen. The vessel was flying a Russian flag, which was granted to it temporarily at the time of the capture, and it too was suspected by Washington of violating U.S. sanctions that, of course, are linked to Venezuelan oil exports. And so its interception was the first known U.S. seizure of a Russian-flagged oil tanker in recent memory. Now, according to international maritime law, what the United States is doing is illegal. There are no questions about that. This is illegal, and it is very, very provocative. This maritime campaign is part of a broader effort the U.S. has dubbed Operation Southern Spear. It is a form of naval quarantine that is designed to halt ships suspected of carrying embargoed oil. Now, remember, the United States is not a global policeman. It does not have the authority to carry out these aggressive acts that actually contradict the basics of international maritime law. Regardless of how you feel about Venezuela, regardless of how you feel about Russia or Washington, this is very, very black and white here. It is completely illegal, and it is meant to provoke. The United Nations has called for respect for international law in response to these interceptions, but similar to any other UN statement, it's mostly just rhetoric that falls on deaf ears. In Moscow, officials have condemned U.S. maritime seizures, and broader commentary in Russian media actually perceives the United States blockade strategy as aggressive and destabilizing, which it clearly is. So, what does all of this mean? On the legislative front, the United States appears poised to expand its legal tools for pressuring both Russia and the global network that supports its economic interests. If Graham's brainchild, the sanctions bill, moves forward and ultimately becomes law, it will reshape the dynamics of the global energy market. No questions about that, no doubt about that. And it will do so especially for countries that have relied on Russian crude at discounted prices amid the turmoil of war and sanctions. Meanwhile, on the operational front, the United States has also assumed a very aggressive method to effectively approach international law, and it has assumed very aggressive posturing in general. It's taking it to the extreme. It is already taking decisive actions at sea, intercepting, boarding, and detaining vessels that it believes are part of what it refers to as illicit export routes. This bold enforcement action, which combines naval presence, Coast Guard operations, and legal sanctions, is one of the most assertive examples of U.S. sanctions enforcement in decades. Now, taken together, it does appear that legislation and military operations are signaling a shift in U.S. policy. And the shift is economic and maritime tools are being designed, and they're becoming integral instruments of foreign policy that the Trump administration is willing and able to use. Whether the strategy succeeds at the end of the day in its strategic objectives remains to be seen, but for now the world is watching as law, politics, and naval power converge in a very high-stakes game with major implications for energy markets, for international relations, and arguably apparent destruction of international rules and international norms. I will post more on this over on my Substack and Patreon in the next several days. I think this is a fascinating topic, and there's been significant escalation that is directly related to energy trade. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching as always. Support my work if you can. I certainly appreciate it. Thank you to every single one of you who has become a paid subscriber on YouTube, on Substack, and Patreon. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you here tomorrow. Bye for now.